One.
So it wasn't just Black Americans that became motivated by this push to define what rights American citizens have, that what does make an American. And one of the stories of the 50s and the 60s and kind of the Vietnam War, but also the civil rights movement, is that you have lots of other groups that kind of emerge from this period that start pressing for the application of rights and kind of this understanding of rights and kind of stretching and pulling the Bill of Rights for different situations. The foundation of all of this is the college education rates. And you can see here college enrollment peaked up, especially by 1968, 69. Of course, remember, there were deferments if you were in college, so I'm sure that had something to do with it, because you see that right as the Vietnam War is ending, that college enrollment kind of dips, but then it continues to kind of creep back upward. And it's the college enrollment that's going to really kind of change the way people are thinking, as far as how do we understand civil rights? Because you to put kids in a college campus where they're, kind of being encouraged to think about new things. And so this was just kind of one of the results. And remember, you have an overall rejection going back to the 1950s of the way mom and dad lived. So it's not as simple as, oh, well, it's just the college campuses. It also has a whole lot to do with just kind of the time period and the frustration with the Cold War and the ideology that a lot of young people were starting to wonder, well, is that really what all it's about? And you had the Beat generation of the 50s that began to question some of that stuff. And this is going to lead to groups like the Students for Democratic Society. SDS is going to be about a lot of different issues, but they will also focus a lot on protests. You can see their big issue is going to be the Vietnam War, but they will also be, for civil rights. They'll be about Black Power. They will be about, promoting workers' rights. So they have a lot of different issues. They're really fighting against apathy, the apathy of young people, the apathy of even their parents and older people. And there's a whole range there. Just to say all SDS members were into violent protests is probably a disservice. But that was definitely a part of it for some of those groups. So just kind of know that the Students for Democratic Society were about free speech, protesting for a lot of different issues. Now, the next aspect is going to be the counterculture movement, the hippies, if you will. And again, the hippies involve a whole different group of people. You could be a Student for a Democratic Society, an SDS person, and not be a hippie. You didn't have to be both. So again, it's very easy for us to kind of lump all these people into one category, but that's not the case, right? They really, you had hippies that were all about living in the commune and eating, growing their own food and everything's natural and kind of checking out of mainstream society. And sometimes that included the news and voting and all that kind of stuff. And then you would also have hippies that were actively engaged in the Students for Democratic Society, or you could have an SDS member that really rejected kind of that utopian ideal, that sense of we're going to live in a commune and peace and love and all that kind of stuff. So there's a huge range here. So just kind of understand that we're kind of stereotyping a little bit, just for simplicity's sake. So when we talk about counterculture, just understand that these are young people pushing back against the Cold War ideology, pushing back against the Leave It to Beaver 1950s, television shows that you saw in those video clips. They're pushing back against that, saying we want a different society. We want a new society that's about peace and love and, academics and opportunity and all this kind of stuff. And so some of this is going to have to do with, drug use. You're going to have the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco. But it didn't always have to be about that either, right? You could have had people that were into very clean living. So again, lots of love, lots of empathy. That tended to be the big thing. Lots of utopian idealism going on. As far as the hippies, peace symbols, that kind of thing. This is from Woodstock. I've got some images here. The daisy guy putting flowers in the guns. So that's kind of a very common thing about peace, make love, not war, and peace, and all that kind of stuff. So you had lots of that symbolism. Woodstock 1969 is kind of the big music festival that kind of culminated in this top of this counterculture movement. And again, just lots of kind of unique ideas that come from that. And so it wasn't just the hippies, though. It's not just these young people pushing back against Vietnam and that sort of thing. You have women that will begin to be very activated. Feminism, of course, women had changed their roles going back to World War II. The 1950s saw women's rights kind of go back to a more traditional society, but then their daughters are really going to kind of rise up and begin to question that. And some of those women that had worked in the factories, as their kids grow up and go to college and stuff, kind of start to turn around and go, wait a minute, isn't there more to my life? So we have a lot of misperceptions and miscommunications about what feminism is. Feminism is basically social, political, and economic equality. Of course, it gets labeled with a lot of other things these days. National Organization of Women is the key one of those organizations. There's a lot of nuances to that. So just if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. But for your purposes, you need to be sure that you understand that the National Organization for Women is the organization that pushes for women's rights, that now that The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, this is the book that kind of launches the women's movement in the late 60s and 70s, that really and these women begin to take the tactics that they had seen with the Black civil rights movement, with marches and signs and protests and legislation and all that kind of stuff that's going to happen to really kind of change the way people work. Please note that we have the Equal Pay Act, we have Title IX. Title IX is very important for providing equal funding for girls' programs at the public school and the college level, and that kind of thing. The Equal Rights Amendment will try to kind of be pushed through. It will fail ultimately. So we don't have a constitutional equality amendment. But Title IX and the 14th Amendment pretty much handle kind of the understanding of women being equal citizens. And so Gloria Steinem is also another leader, Betty Friedan. The Roe v. Wade decision is a very controversial one, which we won't really touch on in class, but this is a part of the women's rights movement and that kind of thing. And that's probably partly why feminism can sometimes be perceived as very negative. So affirmative action is the other concept you need to be familiar with. Affirmative action is this idea, and I kind of put this word wall up here, about all these different ideas related to that. It's about tackling social and economic discrimination in federal policies. It's also about making sure that students of color that have been disadvantaged previously have opportunities to go to college as far as college admittance. That because for many of those kids in the late 60s and early 70s, their educational system had not been as great as white students. And you're going to see you still have a few, hangover segregation issues. Busing is a real issue here. African American groups like PUSH and the Congressional Black Caucus, they're all kind of working together, after the death of Martin Luther King. Now, the big question, the big dilemma with affirmative action is reaching out to help disadvantaged students of color. Is that fair to white students? This is particularly true if you're talking about college admissions. If you're trying to get into college and you're a white student, is it fair for you to have to compete not only with students of your own race that have advantages, but is it fair for you to compete with students of color who are given a special advantage or a special door to come in because of their skin color alone? And this is a very debating issue. It's a very challenging issue. U.S. Regents versus Box kind of limits how much schools can do this. You have to be kind of careful there. You need to be sure that you know that Cesar Chavez, United Farm Workers, pushed for migrant farm worker rights and that kind of thing. Use some of the same things. LULAC, League of United Latin American Voters, political equality, the American Indian movement. That's one of your other issues that you'll be looking at on your portfolio. and I'll talk about those a little bit more in class. The rise of environmentalism, the EPA, and that kind of thing, consumer safety. These are all issues that kind of use the same tactics, but we'll talk about those in class.